And thank you everyone for coming along tonight. I'm David Heald, as Robin says, and I have given this presentation once before. I will say that there may well be an IT challenge to all this. This is the first time I've tried it on Zoom, and it's also the first time I'm doing this on a Chromebook, and it was only an hour ago I realized that Chrome doesn't like Microsoft products. So I'm crossing my fingers that my PowerPoint is going to work in the Google Slides thing I've got open. Or I did have a run through, and it only seems to not show the films. I've got a couple of little snippets of film I took, and I'm afraid they don't seem to work. But all the rest of the experience will be as it would normally be. But I hope you'll give me a little leeway if things need a little technical nudge along every now and then. I should probably also say that I am by no means an expert in Costa Rica. I will tell you a lot about my experiences, how I came to go there, what I felt when I was there. I mean, obviously I went from a Quaker point of view, but as well as the Quaker point of view, I think there's the write-up said there would be some talk of environmentalism and talk of pacifism. And obviously, though those are interesting from a Quaker side of things, they're also interesting in general. And I hope to bring out a few of those things that I learned while I was over there. I'm happy to be questioned. I don't know if I can answer everything, but I will certainly give it a good go. So I look forward to getting some questions at the end. But what I'm going to do first, I'm going to be very adventurous and click on share screen and see what happens. So you'll have to bear with me a second. But any moment, what I'm hoping is you should see Costa Rica presentation. If you don't, yes. Someone shout.
Yeah. No, we
do. All disappeared. Yep, brilliant. Thanks.
We do have that.
Great, brilliant. So that's me, obviously on the right, standing in front of a big tree, and it's a brief travel through history, flora, fauna, and pacifism. And I suppose the thing to start with is where it is. So if that is Central America there, the orange location, sort of 3/4 of the way down, is Costa Rica, with the purple location to the right is Panama, and Nicaragua to the north. So Costa Rica is between the Caribbean, and the picture of me there in the hammock is from the Jamaican coast, and of course it's also got a Pacific coast, and they are two very different sides of things. But it also sort of puts its history in context, because we'll talk a little bit about the Spanish conquest of Costa Rica, but we'll also talk about the British influence, which was again something I didn't really think about till I was there. And to give you a little bit of a background on me, I hadn't really ever thought about going to Costa Rica until my partner said it would be an interesting place to go, because she'd read about the environmentalist side of things. And it was only when reading the guidebook that I discovered there was a Quaker connection as well, which I'm going to talk a little bit about and show you a brief film from YouTube, I hope. And it just became more and more fascinating the more and more time I spent reading about it, and the more and more time I was there. So I went as a sort of novice in terms of everything I was expecting, and came away quite fascinated by what has been done in Costa Rica. So very brief history. Before what they call pre-Columbian civilization, so before Columbus arrived, there's a history that stretches back 5,000 years, and there's at least 22 indigenous tribes that still remain from those times. Part of what they're quite famous for is this incredible stonework that you can see in the pictures. The Bulls of Costa Rica is what I'd heard about from Arthur C. Clarke's Mysterious World, if that doesn't age me too much. For others of you, you'll be wondering what that is. But there's these thousands of these perfectly spherical stone bulls have been found throughout the forests in Costa Rica. And there's no clue as to how tribes without the tools we have nowadays would be able to make them. But there are thousands of them, different sizes, different types. And these are some which are in the National Museum in San Jose. But also, top right, there's a corridor from the National Museum, which, as well as having that big ball in the middle of it, shows you that the stonework was quite intricate, and there were some quite extraordinary bits of chiseling, carving, however they did it, that shows that there was an extensive network of tribes, if you like, before the Spanish arrived and made it part of the Spanish Empire from the 16th century onwards. They became independent from Spain in 1821, really as part of the sort of wave of freedom from the Spanish Empire in that time. And then the interesting thread I'm going to pull on in a minute is that they've become an officially pacifist country from 1948. Now, if you go on, my source is Wikipedia here. If you go on Wikipedia and look for officially pacifist countries, there are 21 in the world. Now, there are huge arguments as to what makes a pacifist country and what doesn't make a pacifist country. And I'll come on to tell you why Costa Rica claims that title. But of those 21, it is easily the biggest. It has 5 million people living in it. It's obviously got quite a significant land area. I mean, a small country, but at the same time, not an island nation, as some of the pacifist ones are. And the capital is San Jose, and that's where all those photos were taken. And most people live in San Jose as well. It is quite sparsely populated outside the main city. Just to give you a little insight into the colonial impact, this is a picture taken in the Meleku Reserve. Now, there are 650 Melekus left. They thought that at the time of the Spanish arrival, there was probably about 6,000, and a mixture of Spanish aggression and smallpox has helped reduce them to where they are today. Some of the 22 indigenous tribes have chosen to integrate into Costa Rican society, but the Meleku are one of the tribes that's decided to stay apart with an attempt to preserve their language and their culture and so on. And what us tourists were doing in this little group here was painting shells. And we'd been talking about spirit animals and so on, and they got us to paint shells to show our spirit animal, that kind of thing. And I mean, yeah, it's put on for the tourists, and we paid money for it, so we helped in that sense. But away from the sort of tourist area, there is the traditional Meleku Reserve, where they practice the agriculture and so on that they've done for centuries. So that shows there was a huge colonial impact, and for the most part, most Costa Ricans are either descended from the Spanish settlers or a mixture of Spanish settlers and natives, with one exception. On the Jamaican coast, there are quite a few people descended from Jamaican slaves brought in by the British, because once the Spanish left and the country became independent, the British arrived and decided that Costa Rica was going to be a source of coffee for the British Empire. So every farm you could possibly think of in Costa Rica was converted to making coffee, and that was used to supply the British Empire, right up until the time that Kenya started to produce coffee, at which point the British left and the economy collapsed. So every now and then, when I've given this presentation to people, like I've done it a couple of times, aside from the Quaker presentation, we get to the Spanish aggression and people say, oh, well, at least this is one bit of the world the British haven't affected. But unfortunately, that's not the case. But what's interesting in terms of the mix of people is the Jamaican coast then has a slightly different culture to the rest of Costa Rica. And we had a lot of dishes. I mean, I'm a vegetarian, so obviously I didn't eat this, but there was a lot of jerk chicken and sort of ginger drinks and plantains. There was very, very definitely a Caribbean feel to it, which there isn't on the other side. So that's a little bit of the sort of history of how Costa Rica comes to be where it is now. Now, this is a few photos. I've tried to put in some sort of some idea of some of the wildlife. And again, I'm sorry about the white bit. This is the bit where one of the videos doesn't work. This is Tortuguero National Park. So if you remember the map, the bit looking out towards Jamaica is a little peninsula called Tortuguero, and that is a place which is only accessible by water. And so we had to get a boat to go there. And this is some of the sort of there was turtles there, birds, and that's bats in the bottom right hand corner. And originally, if that film had played in the top left hand corner, it would have shown you the boat taking us there. But all the supplies for this national park come by boat. And one of the reasons I mention it is because it's lush rainforest, trees, bushes, plants everywhere, extraordinary wildlife. But this national park didn't exist until after 1975. It was a timber area. And what our guide said was, if you see a big tree in the national park that's older than 50 years, then it was a tree someone couldn't cut down. That's the only reason there would be any trees there. And it was completely decimated by the timber industry. And then in 1975, the decision was made to just let it regrow. And this extraordinary lush rainforest now exists on the Jamaican coast. I was born 3 years before then. So in my lifetime, this extraordinary place has grown, which is a little insight into part of Costa Rican environmentalism. And we'll come back to that in a bit. But before I get into the environmentalism fully, I want to talk a little bit more about the pacifism. So in 1948, Costa Rica had gone through this extraordinary civil war. And what had happened is a government had been elected, the army had tried to depose it, the country had descended into civil war, and that had been Costa Rica's history for most of the 20th century. And this extraordinary man, Jose Figueres Ferrer, came to power, and he'd actually been on the victorious side in the Civil War, and made this amazing declaration that from then on, there would be no armed forces in Costa Rica. The photos there are from the National Museum in San Jose. And what he did to show the change is he took that hammer, it's a rather cross-shaped hammer, so it looks a bit strange in the bottom right picture. And the photo above the hammer is him hitting the national barracks with a hammer. And it was symbolic of, from now on, we don't need the armed forces. And the barracks were converted into the National Museum. And that plaque is the point on the barracks which he hit with a hammer. Mm. And what I found extraordinary about this is that when I told people back in Britain, either before I went or after I came back, that it was a pacifist country, the reaction was, oh my goodness, that must be a really violent place. There was a real failure to understand that actually Costa Ricans are very proud of being at peace. When we were on you probably gathered from the photo, myself and Amanda, my partner, we were on a part of a group. And as we traveled around, at one point our guide said, Costa Rica is the world's largest pacifist state. And one of our people in our group said, oh, like Switzerland. She was from Liechtenstein. And our guide said, no, Switzerland's not a pacifist state. And she said, but, we don't attack other countries. Our army is for self-defense. And he said, but you've got an army. And if you've got an army, then you could go to war and you're not a pacifist country. And they had a very interesting argument about it. But for the Costa Ricans, they have no armed forces. So for them, that's what pacifism means. Now, they do have a police force. Jose Ferrer said, we'll keep the police because no one's perfect, which I really like as a comment. So there is internal, ways of keeping the peace. But in general, it's a pacifist country. And it's also done very well in terms of not being too affected by the drug trade. We had the Costa Ricans we spoke to said they were worried. And there had been an increase in violence in the society related to drug gangs and so on in the years previous. But I looked that up before this talk. And you're talking about something like 12 murders per 100,000 people as a figure for drug-related deaths, which compares to, I think, Guatemala is 48 deaths per 100,000 people. So when Costa Ricans worry that they're becoming a more violent society, they're starting from a much more peaceful point. And that, I think, is a lot down to this proud tradition of being pacifist. As I note there, and one of my favourite bits in the National Museum was they showed the coat of arms before 1948, which had guns on it, and then after 1948, it has coffee beans. So, that was the statement of intention. And this is also a nice thing that they say. I think this is a little bit of fun at poking at the USA, really. But 8% of their GDP is spent on education, and they always say that's with funds that would have been spent on the army, which can choose other things to spend on, but at the same time, they always like pointing out that's more than the USA spends of its GDP on education. So you've got this really extraordinary moment in 1948 that Costa Rica decides to embrace pacifism, and it has still kept it to this day. It's not been involved in any kind of the sort of Central American wars. If you think about the reputation that Panama and Nicaragua to the south and to the north respectively have, it's been extraordinarily stable as a country since that time. One of the things they say is that that's because they can't get involved in local disputes. I would say there's been some interesting things that I've read in terms of sort of violence in Costa Rica. There was a time in the early 70s when a group hijacked a plane and flew it to Costa Rica, thinking, pardon me, thinking this will be a good place to land. These are the pacifists; they won't attack us. And the police were called in, and they were told to shoot the tires of the plane to stop the hijackers getting away, which apparently they hadn't thought would happen because that's violence, and Costa Ricans don't do violence. But what Costa Ricans would say is they do in that sort of circumstance, but actually not to one another, and that's the key thing. So that, I have to say, is a fascinating side of pacifism. And I put pacifism before the Quaker connection for a very good reason, because Quakers came to Costa Rica after it became a pacifist place. It'd be very easy for me to give you the impression that, Quakers turned up and suddenly the place became a pacifist place. It was quite the opposite. And I'm going to stop sharing for a moment to see if I can do something slightly different. So you should be back with me in the room. And I'm going to share a different screen, which hopefully will show you a very, very short video about Quakers in Costa Rica. So bear with me again, and we'll see if this works. So I'm hopefully now sharing you a bit of YouTube. And if that will maximize, I will just play this for you, a bit of this for you.
For decades, Costa Rica has invited tourists to enjoy its natural beauty and use their dollars to conserve it. One of the deepest roots of this ecotourism traces back to a group of American Quakers. They arrived in the 1950s and carved out a community they called Monteverde, or Green Mountain, a town and cloud forest reserve that form one of the best-known tourist spots in this Central American nation. Today, the influence of Quakers can be seen in local produce and food that's on the grocery store shelves, in the recreation at the Friends School and Center, which is a social hub for the larger community of Costa Ricans and settlers. Over time, the number of original Quaker pioneers has dwindled to a relative handful. At Sunday services, there is no priest or leader, no sermon, no music, as is typical for many Quaker congregations. It's called a meeting and mostly conducted in silence.
Well, the basic tenet, I think, of Quaker faith is the belief, the strong belief there is that of God in every person. That if you sit in silence and listen, that you can be led by the Spirit.
Lucille, or Lucky Gwindon, was among the earliest arrivals here, led on an extraordinary journey by another basic tenet of Quaker faith, which goes back to 17th century England. That's pacifism.
All men between 18 and 25 will be required to register. I repeat.
Back in 1948, the U.S. reinstituted the draft, requiring all young men to sign up. Lucky Gwendon's husband-to-be, Wolf, resisted. When we visited, Wolf Gwendon was in poor health and unable to speak. He died just 4 weeks later. Another resistor from Alabama, Marvin Rockwell, now 93, said they were willing to face the consequences.
We were arrested and sentenced to a year and a day in prison. We were actually in prison for a third of the sentence, out on parole of balance.
Far more influential than prison was a piece of advice given to them at sentencing by the judge in that Alabama court.
He said, if you can't obey the laws of this country, then you should look for another one. So that planted a seed.
Rockwell, Gwendon, and 2 other resistors, joined by other families from Fairhope, Alabama, 44 people in all, decided to find a new country, unable to reconcile their beliefs with a system that they believed was preparing the United States for the next war. Costa Rica was a natural fit. It was encouraging immigration and in 1949 abolished its army.
It was also a country with mostly middle class, not the extreme rich and the extreme poor. And they were also welcoming people to come in and help develop it. So when my husband, then not my husband-to-be, wrote to me, how would I like to live in Costa Rica? Of course.
You'd grown up in Iowa.
I grew up in Iowa.
The Costa Rica they chose to live in could not be more different than Iowa or Alabama. With proceeds from the sale of land back home, they purchased some 3,400 acres in a lush tropical mountainscape. The road here, treacherous even today, well, they had to build it.
The road when we first came, well, like I said, was an ox cart trail. You had to have 4-wheel drive, chains, maybe carry an extra axle with you, and have a winch. And even then, sometimes the people had to get pulled out by oxen. But
there was no clinic. The community counted on faith and, ironically, the military experience of Marvin Rockwell.
In the Second World War, I was drafted and wouldn't carry a rifle, so they put me in the medical corps, which was the training I got was very valuable here because when we first got here, the closest doctor was Punta Arenas, 6 hours away by jeep.
In time, a school and community center were built, land was cleared, and farms established. The Gwendons went on to have 9 children. Their dairy farm is now operated by son Benito Gwendon. Together, international conservation groups in the Quaker community, led by Wolf Gwendon, agreed to protect the forest from mining, logging, or even further human encroachment.
Wolf spent the first 20 years of his life cutting down trees and the rest of his life saving trees. So.
The Quakers themselves contributed 1/3 of the acres they'd purchased earlier toward the Cloud Forest Reserve. Today, some 250,000 eco-tourists visit here each year. A smaller number of North Americans have come and stayed. Hawaii native Nicolette Smith settled here with her husband, Randall.
It didn't take us long at all to realize this is the perfect place to have kids. I mean, they're growing up a lot like I did in Hilo, a small town, where everybody knows who you are.
For the Smiths, the Friends School and Center quickly became a social hub to meet others, a place for cultural events as well as religious observances. Many of those who attend Sunday services are not Quaker.
We're not out to convert anybody. There are branches of Quakerism where that's what they do, but we not our branch.
So I'm going to come back to you now and stop sharing, just because the last minute and a half there and that film is a bit more in depth on Quakers rather than Costa Rica. So I'm going to just come back to Costa Rica. But you can see there that you had that interesting association in time of the Americans reinstituting the draft. And then just those several years later, those American Quakers settling in Costa Rica. And where they chose to settle, where they were showing, where they built the road and everything, that is up in the mountains in the center of Costa Rica. And it is, as they said, it's still very hard to get to. But I was very lucky to actually go there, and I'm going to show you some photos of it in a minute. But the principle that they bought, I think that Costa Rica was already becoming a, proud. It's already becoming a pacifist country, and it was certainly proud of that already. But I think what the Quakers brought was a sort of focus on the environmentalism side of it. When you go to the Monteverde Cloud Forest Reserve that they set up, you're allowed into, I think, no more than, it's certainly less than 10% of it. And there's plenty of it, which is just classified as not for humans to develop, to touch, to be involved in any kind of way. And that's quite extraordinary to me, even within the sort of national parks that you get anywhere. And part of that came from the Quakers. I will just say something about that video, which I've shown now 3 times. And there's something which annoys me a little about it, which is they say of Martin Rockwell, ironically, they used his military experience. There are plenty of Quakers. If you don't know Quakers, there's plenty of Quakers who've done what he did, which is refused to carry a rifle, but served in medical treatment or supporting people through medicine. So it's not really ironic, I don't think, but that's me being a little bit of a quibbler as a Quaker. So I'll just get back to sharing my screen with you again, and I'll get back to the presentation now. You've just had a chance to look at some of the history of the Quakers there. So I will say this about Quakers, is that when I went to Monteverde, as we on the little bus going up that little road, our tour guide said, "Oh, you have to understand that the people here who settled here were Quakers." And helpfully, my partner said, "Oh, David's a Quaker." But he high-fived me as well, which was lovely. And the fact that they have a knowledge of who Quakers are and what Quakers believe was quite something for me. But to make it a bit more general and not just about Quakers, they have this philosophy called pura vida, which I think literally is like pure life. But it's sort of enjoying the life you've got, enjoying what you've got, and having a happiness around everything that a day can bring. And what I heard quite often is how sorry they felt for Europeans, who they described as strict, which I think is quite an interesting word to use, but not really embracing life, which I thought was quite interesting. And there was a Gallup poll in 2019 that established that Costa Rica was one of the world's happiest countries. Now, how you measure happiness, you can argue about as well, but I thought that was quite an interesting thing. And also, they would say in Costa Rica, their average life expectancy is 78.5 years, and that's longer than the average life expectancy in the US. You can see there's a lot of comparisons with the US go on, but it is interesting, certainly. So here's just a few photos from around Costa Rica. Again, the top left is the Tortuguero National Park, which you can only get around by water. Something of bananas hanging in a fruit market. There are 100 different kinds of bananas, and it's actually quite sad to say that in Costa Rica, the most visible ones were the same yellow ones we get here. I was really hoping to have some of the other kinds of bananas. In the middle is the road to, that's the Arenal volcano in the middle of Costa Rica, which is one of the most volcano-shaped volcanoes I've ever seen. And then the other coast there is the Pacific coast. And obviously, for those of you who've traveled, that's a mosquito net, which was one of the most bizarre things, never having slept in one before. It was like having a huge veil over you, but that was part of the Costa Rican experience. So just to get into environmentalism quickly, some of their sort of basics of what they believe. So there's no animal selfies, there's no zoos, there's no safari parks. Everything is done as national parks where animals are basically there to live their life. And if you spot one, you spot one. You don't see them in cages. There's a limit on visitor numbers. So when we went to Monteverde, we had to check into the rainforest. There's a big gate, the one entrance point you can get in as a human, and only a certain number of people are allowed in at any time. And then you get an hour, and once you've had your hour, you have to go out or you can be fined to stop there being any large buildup of people. with one exception, and the exception's in the photo. That's Manuel Antonio National Park in the Pacific. And as you can see in that picture, it is just filled with people. That was on a sunny day. They've got a great beach there. So it was filled with people. And that's the sort of what happens if you don't limit visitor numbers. Phones are banned in a lot of areas, including where turtles are laying eggs. You can imagine people going along, snapping a selfie with the turtle as it's trying to lay an egg. And 43% of the land area of Costa Rica is protected in some way, and only 1% of that is accessible to tours. So it's not just protected, it's not being used for human tourism as well as development. I say 43% of the land area. Our guide said, I'm so sorry that it's not 50%. Maybe you'll come back when it's 50%. I believe the total in Wales is 15%, and that's the highest in the UK. So we are some way behind Costa Rica in protected land. And it's worth saying that there's a real hard bit to get your head around in Costa Rica. Where I showed you Tortuguero, they want to extend the national park, the Tortuguero National Park, based around the water systems. But to do it, there are 2 hotels in the way. So the obvious answer is to knock down the hotels. And our people in our group were saying, but then you won't get the tourists. You know, you need tourists. And the answer was, if the tourists being there is destroying nature, then we don't want the tourists. Which again is sort of, it's a flip of what you're expecting somehow. You know, the same is true of limiting people coming into your national parks. If it will damage the national park to have too many people in, then we'll limit the number of people coming in. And I think that's a discussion which you can see all over the world in prime tourism spots and how you regulate tourists. But for Costa Rica, it's very much nature comes first in the protected areas. I mentioned the huge reforestation projects since the 1970s. Manuel Antonio National Park, which I've misspelled the acronym of, I've just realised there, which is the one in the photo, for all that it's got too many tourists in. That's another one. You can see there, lush rainforest. That was all dairy farms until 1975. And again, just let's buy up all the dairy farms. Let's get rid of all the farming there, and let's just let a rainforest regrow. And they did exactly that. So it's another one that in my lifetime, that rainforest now exists, which freaks me out. And the Costa Ricans haven't stopped there. Their latest plan is to become the first zero emissions country by 2050. And that's sort of an ongoing discussion in Costa Rica. They already get 99% of their energy from renewable sources. So they've kind of got that one sorted out. And they've got a lot of restrictions on what you can build and where, and trying to stop over tourism. But that's a sort of new goal. Can they reach that before anyone else? But I think what that gives you an insight into is the idea you've got a society where people have bought into the idea of pacifism, and people have bought into the ideas of environmental protection. So unfortunately, this is the bit where the videos don't work. You're going to have to take my word for it that that's a sloth in a tree, very slowly climbing up a tree, being watched by tourists. And I'm afraid we're all standing on the road. We were in our tourist bus, and suddenly someone shouted, "Sloth!" The driver slammed on the brakes. We all piled out, and we all filmed it climbing a tree. And you can hear in the background the people driving along the road sounding their horn, going, "Get off the road!" So I'm not going to claim that I didn't in some way contribute to the bad reputation tourists have in Costa Rica. But we did see a sloth moving. And unfortunately, this one, you probably can't quite see. There's a monkey in the middle. And again, I saw that in Tortuguero National Park in a tree. And what's incredible about those monkeys is seeing them hanging by their tail. I've never seen a creature with such an extraordinary tail, just sort of hanging upside down and using all the strength in its tail to eat things in the tree. But to make the obvious point as well, that monkey is there in that was Tortuguero again. So again, that's there, and those monkeys are there, and all that wildlife is there because the rainforest was allowed to regrow, and they came back. So my last point is going to be about Monteverde very, very quickly. I said it's up in the mountains, and there's a picture of the rainforest, and that it was a Quaker settlement, as you saw in the video, from 1951. And it's a rainforest reserve in the mountains with a limit on numbers. And what you've got there is there's a Quaker school, there's a Quaker meeting, there's a Quaker cemetery, and a Quaker farm. If you don't know Quakers, the reason for the Quaker cemetery is, even though all those Quakers had emigrated to Costa Rica, they still couldn't be buried on land which was, you won't be surprised to know that the main religion of Costa Rica is Roman Catholicism, and so Quakers were not allowed to be buried in consecrated ground, so they had their own cemetery. And if you ever see a Quaker grave, it tends to just have the name of the person on as well. They're not big showy sort of carvings. So that was really interesting to see. And there's a whole school there and a whole commitment to education, which has grown out of the sort of Quaker belief in education. And it's fully bilingual, English and Spanish. And as well as educating the children of the Quaker families, they also educate locals in their school as well. So the idea is that people living locally in Monteverde can benefit from the Quaker presence as well. They do also run a couple of dairy farms still, as you saw with the cheese in the film. Their ice cream is very good. And I say this as someone who doesn't like dairy products and doesn't much like dairy farming. The Quaker ice cream is very good. So there's that sort of presence in the middle of Monteverde. There is also a Quaker pacifist centre in San Jose. I would say outside that, most of the places you would find for worship in Costa Rica are Roman Catholic, but there is that very interesting Quaker presence in the midst of it. And there you go. Sorry, I'd forgotten I'd got a picture of a gravestone. That's a Quaker grave in the bottom left-hand corner. I probably won't be able to quite see it on that because it's so small, but it's just got someone's name on. And that's sort of in and around the school. I will say, I set off to try and find the school one morning, and it took me ages. And it was only when I had just about given up and I was walking through the forest thinking, where is this place, that I saw that meeting sign saying Friends Meeting and School on it. That's why I look so happy, or possibly relieved, when I actually found it. But a wonderfully welcoming place. I've since been in communication with them, discussing a couple of things, and I would like, personally, I'm going to intend to fund part of the work they do. I mean, I am not a rich man by any sense, but I'm wealthier than most Costa Ricans, so I'm going to make a contribution. And when I did this talk for Cardiff Quakers, I did say I would encourage Cardiff Quakers to do the same, but that's just my point of view. And I wanted to end with these two quotes from Jose Ferrer, who I am such an admirer of. This is an exemplary little country. We are the example for Latin America, Figueres told the Los Angeles Times in a 1986 interview. In the next century, maybe everyone will be like us. He did live into the century. He was president several times of Costa Rica, I think 3 times in all, and then he retired. And I think that was from when he'd retired. And also one of my other favorite ones is a reporter asked him, how did you create a stable Costa Rican democracy? And he said, we got rid of the general problems, which is a double meaning, of course, which means we got rid of all the generals. And there's a lovely story of him going to a Central American summit and being surrounded by all these Central American dictators in their army uniforms. And he turned around to them and said, well, I'm a pacifist, but I'm the only one in this room who's ever won a war, which is rather neat put down, because of course he'd been on the winning side of the Civil War, and then had that extraordinary act of saying, we don't need the army anymore, get rid of the generals. The final screen, which doesn't work properly when I'm using Google, just says gracias amigos, because I did learn a little bit of Spanish. You'll just have to take my word for that. What can I say about the place? You'll have gathered that I was quite blown away by not just a Quaker presence, that commitment to peace, that commitment to not having armed forces and staying a stable place in the middle of an unstable region, but also that commitment to environmentalism. And I think he's right, Figueres. I think that this century, the world will hopefully catch up with Costa Rica and realise that preservation of the environment is important. But, you know, I felt embarrassed saying to him, saying to our guide, you know, when he was going, oh, only 43% of Costa Rica is protected land, saying, well, you know, it's not anything like that in the UK, but there are some wonderful groups who are doing something towards that. And our guide said, you know, well, maybe you can go back to the UK and maybe you can tell them about Costa Rica, and then maybe people will want to conserve the environment there too. So that's been my contribution to it. And I'm happy to take any questions.